Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you again for joining me. If you watch my content, I'm assuming that you're obviously a writer who's interested in getting published, perhaps through the traditional publishing process. This process is filled with tons of rejection, and oftentimes you don't get any feedback on what you're working on. It's something where you simply submit and hope for the best. And without a feedback mechanism to let you know what you need to improve upon or how to do better, it can be difficult to ever really make improvements in your work. How can you improve if you don't know what you did wrong? Which brings us to this video. Earlier this year, a peer of mine was a judge for a contest here in the US. For just anonymous reasons, I will not mention what the writing contest was or who this individual was. We're kind of in a bit of iffy territory, me discussing this. But suffice to say, they were a judge for a writing contest here in the US, and I will say it was one of the largest ones that the US has. As I happen to know this person, I was able to get a hold of their notes from the contest. These were notes basically on the contestants, and basically, while I was not able to see any of the information specifically, it was more of the notes they had jotted down and made as they were going through. These were personal notes just to kind of help them as they went through the process. And as I said, I was able to get a hold of them. Okay, so these actually aren't the notes. This is just a little prop. The notes are on my phone here. So having gotten a hold of the person's files, I was able to kind of sift through and sort of compile a list of the main reasons why people were selected to go forward in the contest and win, and those that got rejected. It took a while, to be honest, to actually go through this because it was very, very disjointed. These were not meant to really ever be seen by anybody, at least not initially. And it was something where I had to kind of peruse and sort of categorize what got the yeses and what was getting the nos, and just the general comments and feedback that they were offering. Again, I never actually read the pieces themselves, nor understood what these comments were directed towards. These were more just general notes that I had to kind of compile and put together. Now, while this is not directly related, perhaps, to querying agents, the process of submitting to contests is very similar. Instead of an agent perhaps going through a slush pile and looking at multiple people's work, a judge is going through basically a slush pile of submissions and trying to basically find out which ones really stand out. Both are processes of simply trying to eliminate the most amount of work possible and looking for reasons to reject pieces rather than to accept them. With an overwhelming majority of stuff coming in, one can't devote a bunch of time to every single work. So you are constantly trying to look at what gets rejected and what does not. So with that being said, here it is. These are the top reasons why stories were selected to move forward and not get rejected. As a small bonus, I will go through the three categories that were basically deemed as automatic no's. So these were three areas where if they noticed a story fell into these categories, they were getting immediate rejections. They were not going to move on to the next round. These areas I categorized into a predictable plot, something that was like preachy or was focused on just delivering a lesson, and anything that had, I guess, poetic language that wasn't working. Throughout a lot of these comments, it was commentary on like forced rhyming or force rhythm. So the story has a certain beat to it that when you read it, just if the beat was off or it was not rhyming the way the author probably intended it to, it just sounded off. That got a rejection. I know it's kind of a weird way of categorizing these things. Again, this is me kind of filing through a bunch of notes here. Wasn't really a hard and fast rule, but something to consider there. If you have a predictable plot, if your story does have a kind of lesson that is or exists just to tell a lesson, or if it happens to have a certain rhythm to it that is just simply not working, try and cut those out, because those were three areas where stories were getting just cut out and put in the no category right away. So with that out of the way, let's now get into the three areas of focus that really made the top stories stand out. So the first and kind of the main area of focus was voice. This seemed to be a real big focus for this individual. A lot of the stories that moved forward or did not move forward were because of voice. So, in other words, either if it was a rejection, if the voice simply was not working, one of the very common comments was that the voice didn't match the narrator, either, I'm assuming, in terms of like education or age. So, in this case, if the narrator was a young child but was speaking very eloquently, that was getting rejected. Um, or if the voice didn't reflect the time period. There were some comments about how the stories took place in a different time, but they were using jargon or language that was of the modern age. So, right there, that's something to keep in mind. Your voice should be consistent with your character. It should have some interest and it should match the time period. Um, these sound very basic, like very basic sort of things, yet this was the top, one of the top, I mean, perhaps, actually, probably was perhaps the top reason why people were getting rejected right there or moving forward. If their voice was simply not working, they were going right into the nose. I'll add on two things with that. There were some comments about how some of the stories had a compelling voice initially, but the voice did not remain consistent throughout the stories. And also that the voice was too distant. So what that usually means when it comes to writing is that the narrator is too far removed from the story. It sounds you're basically taking the reader out of kind of the immediate experience of the story with the character's voice. So the second area of focus was on character and character development. Many of the comments on these pieces, especially the ones that got into like the maybes or even looks like some of the yeses, was in regards to characters and their development. And what was working for him was if the character felt believable, which is kind of subjective, but obviously just believing in the character. If they used dialogue effectively to build them up. There was a lot of comments as well on good writing, but the character feeling distant in the piece. Again, this is a bit sort of subjective and something that it's not necessarily easy to identify, but making sure that your character feels immediate, making sure that your character feels like they're immediately part of the story is going to be absolutely huge. And the other thing that was noted was, and I guess this is very similar to the voice, is the fact that the point of view matches the style. So in other words, some of the comments were on how the story might be written in first person, but it simply feels too distant. It doesn't feel like the narrator is part of the story. It feels almost like it's a third person story being told in the first person. So keeping the character as an immediate part of the tale is very, very critical. Just to add on to what I just said there, I did mention dialogue and it working for the character. There were some common comments about dialogue and stories that were getting rejected. The main one was that dialogue feels forced or the tone of the dialogue doesn't match the story. In other words, you're trying to insert comedy into a more serious tale or serious moments, and the work is just not landing. So, again, another consideration to keep in mind. The third area of comment that I've noted is pacing. When it comes to pacing, one of the top comments was the idea that the author is being deliberately mysterious. In other words, you're basically purposely withholding information to build suspense or a mystery without any logical reason to do so. That was, but that was on here quite a bit. So something to keep in mind. I'm putting that under the category of pacing. But again, if you're writing a mystery, writing a thriller, don't just be deliberately vague or deliberately hold information back. Have a reason to justify doing so. As we get more into it, the main comments about pacing really come down to just the finesse of too quick or too slow of a story. There were some comments about how the scenes worked well or the descriptions were working well, but there's simply no action happening. Like, I'm assuming for probably quite a while. Also, telling and explaining too much was also mentioned on here a ton. Slow pacing, again, just something that I saw a lot on here, as well as something on the other side of it, which is getting too much backstory without anything immediate. So in other words, just moving forward, but just too much of kind of learning what happened to the character without getting into the actual story. In fact, there was actually an actual quote on here about how I'm 20 pages in and I only know the backstory. So I don't know what story that was, but keep that in mind as well. Don't throw a bunch of backstory in at the start of these tales. And when you do use backstory, try and keep it to just the necessary parts of it. All right. So this is kind of the TLDR section, right? If you didn't want to sit through what I just went over here, basically it was character development, voice, and pacing that made up the core areas of either going forward or getting rejected. Those were the things that the authors were basically being judged upon. There was a ton of other information here, but a lot of it was a bit more specific to the individual tales. So keep that in mind. Obviously, your stories are going to have individual things to work on, but these should be the three key areas you should be focusing on here. And if you can avoid a lot of what I just mentioned, I suspect, just based upon what I got right here, you'll probably do a lot better. So go back through your stories, revisit them, and see if you're hitting these critical areas. As a little bonus, I'm going to go through just some of the top comments on stories that actually did do well. These are ones that I don't know if they went forward and won or what, but these were stories basically that definitely were getting the yeses. So let's get into that. For stories that worked, here are some of the comments. Original story. So again, something original is good to have. Lyrical and light. So again, kind of like before, basically where I talked about how rhythm was one of the things that was getting people knocked out. If you try to insert rhythm or poetry into your story, you have to make it work. Rich descriptions that did not slow down the pace. Could see and feel every scene. Again, comes down to just being able to be really good with making us feel the vivid experiences. Perfect pacing, nice balance, moving story forward while giving enough backstory and setting the scene. I think I'll probably end with that one just because it kind of summarizes what they're looking for. Story that moves at a good pace forward, doesn't get bogged down with backstory and details, but yet still gives you a vibrant scene. None of this that I've said obviously is new. If you've been a writer for any amount of time, you know these are main areas of focus, and you know these tend to be very similar comments to what others have said. And yet, it's these same fundamental basics that have gotten these people to win these contests, or at least move forward. And so I guess what this video is about is kind of reaffirming the fundamentals, reaffirming that you go back and you check your fundamentals and that you retool them to the point where you have mastered them. It's not necessarily about being the fanciest or coming up with the most original plot or being, having the greatest idea for a tale. It's really about mastering these kind of fundamentals. And this is an art. It's something that it's hard to be very prescriptive and tell you exactly what to do. It's something you have to look at, assess, and just be able to intuit and fix. So if you are someone who has been struggling with getting your work noticed, if you've been amassing piles of rejections, consider that. Consider these areas that I just brought up. Revisit them. See if you have mastered these kind of fundamentals in your pieces. It's one thing to know this information. It's another thing to be able to apply it effectively. And with that as well, if you have enjoyed this piece, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe. As a quick reminder too, my novel Crease, which is coming out in February, is now out for pre-order. The links are down in the description. And with that, I will be signing off now, and I will see you all next week.